Secretary Mabus, it's a pleasure to have you back at the Overby Center.
Thanks, Charles.
We were talking beforehand. Ray came here 7 years ago, just as he was starting his tenure as Secretary of the Navy. And now he's been Secretary of the Navy longer than anybody since World War I. And so Ray, 1.1 million miles later, what do you know now that you didn't know when you sat here 7 years ago?
Well, it's actually 1.3 now.
I missed last week.
You know, I didn't know, I had an inkling, but didn't know how crucial to the world the United States Navy and Marine Corps are, how the world's economy is doing as well as it is because of the Navy and Marine Corps, because we kept the sea lanes open. 90% of trade goes by water. 95% of data goes under the water. As climate change and sea levels rise, instability follows, and we're the first responders. As the Arctic melts, we have to be there. Our responsibilities increase. And I also didn't know just how hard the work was that our sailors and Marines do every single day. And although I'd seen a little bit the last time I was here, I'd been in office about 4 months then, just how good they are at it, at doing it. I mean, I call the Navy and Marine Corps America's away team. We never get a home game. We don't want a home game. And so America just doesn't get to see our Navy and Marine Corps very much. And that's, I also learned that a big part of my job, I think, is to try to connect the American people with their Navy and Marine Corps.
You know, that's a big statement to say that the world economy wouldn't be what it is today if it weren't for the U.S. Navy. And so does that mean if the Navy weren't out there, there would be a lot of mischief and bad things going on out in the oceans?
For the very first time, when you've had a dominant Navy, and the U.S. Navy has been dominant for 70 years, ever since the end of World War II, we've kept the sea lanes open for everybody engaged in peaceful commerce. Before then, if you had a dominant Navy, they kept the sea lanes open for their ships and the ships of their allies. We've kept it open for everybody. And yeah, there would be, I mean, you look around the world today and piracy, transnational crime at sea, nations trying to block other nations from going through international waters. And you're seeing that today. The U.S. Navy has been the guarantor that, no, these are international waters, everybody gets to sail in them, and we're going to be there. And in order to do that, we have to be there. We have to have that presence. We have to, ships back in port don't deter people. Ships back in port don't reassure allies. Ships back in port can't respond instantly to anything from high-end combat all the way to disaster relief. When you're there, you can.
While you've been Secretary of the Navy has taken some major steps to become more part of what society is today. I think of the many things you've done in the area of making the Navy and the Marines gender neutral. That has not been without some headbanging with the generals and the admirals and the commandants. Tell us about that. How hard is it to go up against the commandant of the Marine Corps to get them to do things that you believe are right?
Well, in the first place, you know, the U.S. military and Navy and Marine Corps have gone through these transitions a lot. The armed forces were integrated in the 40s. We started recruiting large numbers of women in the 80s. We repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 2011 or 2010. And every single time this has happened, we've become a stronger force. When we exclude people, when we deny them the honor of defending this country, we weaken the force. And I've had the privilege of serving with 4 commandants and 3 chiefs of Navy, 3 CNOs. And while every one of them has been very forceful and very articulate about what they believe, once a decision is made, they've also moved out to implement it. And so I've got a great working relationship with all the commandants I've served with all the CNOs that I've served with. And that's part of our Constitution. It's civilian control of the military, and the final decisions get to be made by civilians. You have to take military advice very, very seriously, though, because they've spent 40 years in uniform fighting for this country, defending this country. But the reason I've made these decisions to push for the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, to put not women in combat, because women have been in combat a long time. In fact, the commandant said it offended him when people talked about women in combat, because he's buried women that worked for him in Afghanistan and Iraq. But women in ground combat units, in artillery, armor, and infantry. I put women on submarines in 2010 and riverine, but every single time it was to make us a stronger force. I look back at statements that were made in the 40s, why the Marines or the Navy was not integrated. And it was not just that unit morale would be decreased, which is always sort of the thing that people go to, but it was, well, African Americans can't fight. They can't operate in the heat. They can't navigate, doing land navigation. Same thing with women or with LGBT, with gays in the military. And every single time, nothing happened. You opened it up, we became stronger, and we became stronger because for a military force, if you become predictable, if you think in the same ways, you become defeatable because people know what to plan for. And so you need diversity, not just in terms of gender or in terms of race or in terms of sexuality or whatever. You need diversity of thought, of background, of opinion. And it's also the reason I brought ROTC, Naval ROTC, back to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia. But we also put it at Rutgers and Arizona State, the 2 of the most diverse campuses in the country. And every single time one of these decisions made, here's been the rule. Set a standard. Don't deviate from that standard for any group or any reason. Now, you may have to change the standard as conditions change, but there's one standard that everybody meets. If you can meet that standard, then gender becomes irrelevant. Color becomes irrelevant. And how dare we tell somebody, okay, you can meet the standard, but you can't have the job simply because you're a woman. You can meet the standard, but you can't have the job just because you're gay. I mean, how terrible is that? And I'll tell you one last story. I was in Manaus, Kyrgyzstan. We had a big base in Manaus, and everybody going into or out of Afghanistan came through Manaus for a day or so. And I spoke to about 700 sailors and Marines that were just happened to be there the day I was. About half were going in, about half were coming out. And after the event, it was right after we had repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, a corpsman, a medic from the Navy, and Navy medics, Navy corpsmen fight alongside Marines. Marines don't have their own medical team. And he came up and he said, I just want to thank you for the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. He said, I'm gay. He said he'd been in for 12 years. 3 combat deployments. And his biggest fear was he was going to be found out and kicked out of the Navy. Now this guy goes into combat for months at a time, 3 different times, and yet his biggest fear was that he was going to be denied the opportunity to do that simply because of who he loved.
Your commitment to diversity is carried over to the naming of ships, and that created a big national story. The Clarion Ledger devoted half of its front page to that story the day before yesterday. And so I know you've come under some criticism for naming ships for like Harvey Milk and Cesar Chavez and maybe even some civil rights leaders. But I know you're committed to that and have a good response to it. How do you answer the critics?
Well, I answer them in this way. We have always named different types of ships for different things. We name submarines primarily for states. We name littoral combat ships primarily for cities. We name destroyers for naval heroes and members of Congress that have been particularly helpful to the Navy and the Marine Corps. But we name our support ships, our oilers, our supply ships, things like that, after other Americans whose values we admire and who stand for American values that we hold dear. It's always been done this way. The supply ship, the class, the TAKEs, I named the 12th and 13th of those. My predecessors named the first 11. It's called the Lewis and Clark class. Sacagawea was one of the ones that was named for. Amelia Earhart, people like that. And the naming convention, which the Secretary of the Navy also sets, was for pioneers. Well, the first 2 ships, the first ship I named was a Medgar Evers, and the second was a Cesar Chavez. They were pioneers. They were willing to risk their lives for ideals they believed in. And in Medgar Evers' case, he lost his life for the ideal of the right to vote. I thought that was an American ideal worth celebrating.
It's pretty cool that the Secretary of the Navy gets to name the ships.
It is.
And you've named a lot of ships. How many?
86.
86 ships. And do you really have unbridled authority to name a ship for whoever you want? Because I see some candidates out here.
Well, maybe talking to one.
Well, I'm honored to have been on the USS Stennis before. So, but that's quite a thing for a Secretary of the Navy to be able to do that.
Congress weighs in from time to time, and they pass sense of Congress resolutions that they want a ship named X, and that's the way the Gerald Ford, the carrier, was named. But it goes back to the very first Secretary of the Navy, Benjamin Stoddert. Mm-hmm. George Washington was the president, and the Navy bought 6 frigates. George Washington named the first 5, and he said they should be named for principles in the Constitution. And so there were the Constitution, the President, the Congress, the constellation for the stars in the flag. He left the 6th one to Stoddert to name. Stoddert named it the Chesapeake because he lived on the Chesapeake. He defied George Washington to name a ship. Congress required me to do a report in 2011 over my ship naming, as to whether I was following in the footsteps of other secretaries or not, whether I was getting too far out of bounds. And it found what the study did, which was done by our history command, said that I was more of a traditionalist than most secretaries.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, that traditional streak will play out tomorrow in the first quarter of the Ole Miss game when you name 2, and it's already been in the press who they're for. Maybe you could say a word about both of those men and their accomplishment, both of those Mississippi men and their accomplishment.
Naming DDG 125, the Jack Lucas, Jack Lucas, who died only a few years ago in Hattiesburg, was a Medal of Honor recipient from Iwo Jima. And the great thing about the Jack Lucas story was he lied about his age. He enlisted in the Marines. By the time they found him out, which was in Hawaii, he made it through boot camp, he'd made it through all the training, he was 16. And they separated him from his unit and said, "You're going home." He stowed away on a ship. Didn't know where it was going, happened to be going to Iwo Jima. And by the time they found him, it was too late. So he went ashore in one of the first waves. And he's in his fighting hole, and 2 grenades come in. He grabs them both, falls on them. The sand on Iwo is this black, volcanic, very fine sand. He shoved both grenades down into the sand. They both went off. People around him thought he was dead. Corpsman comes along and finds out he's not dead, patches him up. He comes back home, is awarded the Medal of Honor, and then comes back to start the 9th grade.
Golly. So he has to be the youngest Medal of Honor winner ever.
Well, he was the youngest in a long time. In the Civil War, we had some very young recipients because drummers and people like that. But he wasn't through. The Marines discharged him for his injuries, so he joined the Army. And during one of his, he was training to be a paratrooper. One of his jumps, his chute didn't open. And he survived that and lobbied very strongly to go to Vietnam to fight. And the Army wouldn't let him, and it really evidently angered him. That's
Jack Lucas.
That's Jack Lucas. The other one is Lewis Wilson, who was a Medal of Honor recipient for his actions on Guam during World War II, and then later became the Commandant of the Marine Corps in the late 70s, and from Jackson. The story about Lewis Wilson when he was Commandant, that is one of my favorites, was at the very beginning of the all-volunteer force. And somebody came in and said, "Commandant, we're not meeting our recruiting numbers." And his response was, "Then we need to raise our standards." Wow. And so that's when the campaign for the few, the proud, the Marines, you may not be good enough to be a Marine, earned, never given, and they've never had a problem since meeting their recruiting numbers.
Wow. Well, those are 2 worthy names, and you'll get to announce that tomorrow.
I will.
At the game. And
I just want to say one more thing. One of the reasons I announce these things at football games or baseball games or NFL games, and I've announced names at all those, is because you've got 50 or 60,000 people there who are not thinking one thing about the Navy or the Marine Corps, but who, as a result of that, have a connection to that ship. I've named the Massachusetts at a Patriots game. I named the St. Louis at a Cardinals game. I named the Oakland at an A's game. And all of a sudden, people have that connection. Mm-hmm. And you show, there's a picture of the ship, and then Clarion Ledger and other media outlets are gonna follow that ship, and you make that connection between the American people and the Navy, Marine Corps that protect them. And it's a danger in a democracy when that divide gets too big, and this is one of the ways of trying to bring them back together.
Well, you can't mention a baseball game and not mention that you're now in the Guinness Book of World Records. As some of you may or may not know, Ray has not only gone to every Major League Baseball stadium, but he's thrown out the first pitch at every Major League Baseball stadium. So tell me, what was
Is this a good job?
What was What was the worst pitch that you had of those, and what was the best one?
Oh, Charles, I haven't had a bad one.
That's why he's the Secretary of the Navy. Well, most people do get embarrassed.
Look, I've learned 3 things from throwing out first pitches. One is, don't go up on the mound. You're going to one-hop it if you do. 2 is throw high. You're never going to throw it over whoever's catching you. And 3 is nobody at that stadium comes to see the first pitch. And so they don't care. I mean, you can 18 hop it up to the plate, and by the time you walk into the stands, way to go.
Well, you really, that's right. You really have bridged the gap in terms of, you say, dealing with people who don't necessarily think about the Navy or the Marines by doing that. I was reading about you, and you were on the Dan Patrick show, who I enjoy watching, Dan Patrick. And he asked you, which would you rather be, President of the United States or NFL Commissioner? And your answer was?
I'd rather be Secretary of the Navy.
Now, you didn't tell Dan Patrick that, did you? What did you tell Dan Patrick?
Go ahead, you tell him.
No, I'm not. But I think you said NFL Commissioner, didn't you?
I did.
And that's understandable, because who'd want to be President of the United States today?
I mean,
so you're NFL Commissioner. So what would you do what is your view of Colin Kaepernick not standing for the national anthem?
Well, I got asked this question by Sports Illustrated on Wednesday. I did an interview with them because I've not only thrown out a first pitch, I've named a ship the USS Cooperstown for the Hall of Fame city. And we give an award, the Bob Feller Act of Valor Award and the Jerry Coleman Act of Valor Award, one for a sailor, one for a Marine, and both great major league players. And the interview was about that, but the last question was, what about Colin Kaepernick? And the answer is pretty simple. It's one of the reasons we fight. You may not agree with what somebody does, but the first words, first line of the oath that you take is, I do solemnly swear that I will protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's the First Amendment, freedom of speech. That's the reason sailors and Marines and soldiers and airmen, Coast Guardmen serve and fight, is to protect the people's right to do whatever they want to do.
Mm-hmm. Good. You've been to Afghanistan at least 12 times, maybe more since I read last. I'd say that the average person who's not skilled in military strategy and all would say, just talking to one another, Afghanistan's a mess. Iraq's a mess. Is it a mess, and is there anything we can do to keep it from being a mess?
Well, ultimately, both those countries are going to have to solve the problem themselves. They're going to have to solve the internal divisions themselves. They're going to have to solve the way their society is structured themselves. We can help militarily. We can help in other ways, in civil society ways, but we can't impose it. That's beyond us, and it's not something a military is trained to do or really ought to do. I mean, we're trained to do military things and to do those well. The thing that has been sad to me about Iraq and Afghanistan is so many people have lost their lives fighting there, only to see it, in the case of Iraq, dissolve to some extent. And you've got to honor that sacrifice that they made. But again, we can help. And we're by far the greatest military in the world. We got the finest Navy and Marine Corps the world has ever known. But we can't solve a lot of these civil issues that they've got. We can't solve the Shia-Sunni divide or the the Kurdish issue in Iraq. We can't solve the tribal issues in Afghanistan. I think that we've made a good start in both places. And I think that they have the basis to go forward. We're there in many ways for our best interest. I mean, ISIS is a threat to us. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda was a threat to us. And the 9/11 attacks were planned in Afghanistan. And so for us to go in, that was part of our defense of America. So I think that both countries can work, but it's gonna require the people there on the ground to make it happen. And a lot of these rivalries and cross currents way predate us. And what we've got to do is navigate them the best we can, do the best militarily that we can, and give them the opportunity to make the best that their country can be.
You know, we're in the middle of the presidential campaign, and you have the benefit, I guess it's a benefit, of remaining nonpartisan in the midst of a presidential campaign. On the other hand, the military and our defense effort is front and center among the issues in the presidential campaign. So people say a lot of things. The critics say that the Obama administration and our military have not done enough to fight ISIS and to stop it. Would you agree with that, or how would you respond to the critics?
Well, I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I keep hearing the size of the fleet. One of the criticisms I've heard in the last presidential election was the fleet's the smallest it's been since World War I. Well, we also have fewer telegraphs than we did in World War I. So I'm not sure that's a great comparison. But let me give you some numbers here about what this administration has done. And this is not in a partisan sense at all. But in 2001, the U.S. Navy had 316 ships. By 2008, after one of the great military buildups in our history, we were down to 278 ships. In those 7 years, the Navy put 41 ships under contract. That was not enough to keep our fleet from continuing to decline, and it wasn't enough to keep all our shipyards open. I've been there a little over 7 years now, so it's an absolute comparison. So 01 through 08, 09 through 16. I've put 85 ships under contract in the same period, with a 20% smaller top line overall. So we're regrowing the fleet. We will be at 300 ships by 2019, and we'll be at 2021. By 2021, we'll be at 308, which is our assessed need. That's how many ships we need to do every mission that we're called upon to do. What it shows is how long it takes to rebuild a fleet. How long it takes. If you miss a year on a ship, you don't make it up. You can throw money at aircraft, you can throw money at people, you can throw money at weapon systems and get a lot pretty quickly. You can't do that with ships. It takes a long time, it takes a certain skill set, and we simply don't have the capacity to build any more than we're building today. The other example that I would give you, and again, of course it's going to be a Navy example. When the decision was made to strike ISIS in the summer of 2014, we had a carrier on station in less than 30 hours. And for 54 days, we were the only option to attack ISIS, the only one. It wasn't because we didn't have other aircraft in the region, because we did. We had plenty. It was because the countries they were in wouldn't allow them to take off armed to strike. We were flying off sovereign American territory. We didn't have to ask anybody's permission. We just got the job done. But we bought twice as many ships, more than twice as many, in the last 7 years than in the 7 years that preceded it. We bought 35% more aircraft in that same time. We've upped our presence around the world. The rebalanced Asia is real. We're putting 60% of our fleet in the Pacific. and it's a much bigger fleet. And so, and again, I've got to be nonpartisan. I think anybody connected to the military has to be. But the notion that somehow the military is weaker, the military is not ready to do everything the country calls upon that military to do, I think does a disservice to the men and women who serve in the military. They are ready. They are there today, right now. This very moment, we have 100 ships forward, away from the United States. So those are sailors and Marines away from their families. Those are sailors and Marines standing the watch. Those are sailors and Marines launching attacks on ISIS. Those are sailors and Marines we've got Marines in more than 40 countries around the world right now, training, helping people, doing disaster relief, humanitarian assistance, working with our friends and allies. We have the best force we have ever had. We have the strongest Navy, the strongest Marine Corps that we have ever had today. And they are the rightful heirs to the people that fought at Belleau Wood, in the North Atlantic, in the South Pacific, at Iwo Jima, at Hue City, at Chosin Reservoir, and at Fallujah and in Sangin. The people we've got today, the equipment they have today, is the finest in the world, and we are by far the best military in the world. And I never, ever want to send a sailor or Marine into a fair fight. I want to make sure that we continue that, have that overwhelming superiority.
That's good. I'm going to go to the audience for questions in just a minute. I've got a couple others I want to ask. I want to ask another nonpartisan question. Donald Trump said that he knows more than the generals. Is it possible that any Republican or Democratic presidential nominee other than Dwight Eisenhower, who was a general, could know more than the generals?
Well, I'll just put this on me. I mean, I won't talk about anybody else. I mean, I came in and nominated as Secretary of the Navy. I had had a brief, very undistinguished naval career coming out of the Ole Miss ROTC unit here in the late 60s, early 70s. And when I showed up, I mean, for 6 weeks in a little windowless room in the Pentagon, I got briefed in 1 hour chunks from 8 in the morning until 6 at night for 6 weeks, just to get me caught up on what the Navy and Marine Corps were doing. Forget about the Army and the Air Force and the Coast Guard. And even with that, it took a lot of on-the-job training to get me up to speed, to get anybody up to speed on the reach of our troops, on what they're capable of, on the types of equipment they have and that they need, and how we operate. And so, unless you have been maybe an Eisenhower, and I'm not speaking about any particular person, but I'm not the smartest person on earth, but it took me that 6 weeks of intensive, it was like cramming for finals, and then months on the job to just know what we were up to, just know how big our reach was, just know where we had people. And so I think it's pretty tough from anybody, and I'm not talking about presidential candidates, but anybody looking from the outside.
We build this when we started promoting your coming, a life of public service. You've had incredible public service. I think Curtis or one of us said that the broadest public service of a Mississippian of the 20th and 21st century, and we'd only made that limitation because of LQC Lamar, who was on the Supreme Court and Interior Secretary. You had this great slogan when you ran successfully for governor: Mississippi will never be last again. Here we are, last again. Is there any hope?
Well, the only pushback I'm going to give you there is we were pretty obsessive about numbers during my term, and we moved out of last place in everything.
And you even brought the teacher salaries up to the average Southern wage.
We did. We gave teachers the largest pay increase in the country, and we gave higher education.
So what is the key of keeping that moving? Is it leadership, or is it, I mean, are there 2 or 3 things that need to be done to keep somehow momentum going so that we won't be last?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I used to say and still absolutely believe is God didn't draw a line around Mississippi and say, your children shall not learn as much, your children will not have as bright a future or as good a life as anybody else. And I think it's mainly 2 things. I think one is leadership. I think it's keeping the attention on there. I mean, I've said, and I, again, still believe, I'd shut down the rest of government if you did education right. Everything would take care of itself. I made a speech to the Mississippi legislature, and one of the things I said, everyone I'm just about came up and said, what can we do for the military? And I said, here's what you can do. 75%, 3 out of 4 Americans age 18 to 24 do not qualify for the American military. Don't qualify. They don't have a high school degree. They have a health issue, mainly obesity, or they've got a criminal record. So if you want to do something for the military, make education better. If you want to do something for the military, because we don't have any jobs in the military for strong backs and weak minds. I mean, this is the most technically complicated military on earth. Do something about health care if you want to help the military. So you've got to keep that leadership focus, and it's got to be relentless, and people got to get sick of you talking about it, but you have to keep that focus. Secondly, I also think there's got to be a cultural change. We got to value education as much as we value anything else. And the places that have been the most successful, education is at the top of the list of what they brag on people about. I mean, you know, I live and die Ole Miss football. I watched Ole Miss play Arkansas from Azerbaijan last year on my telephone, stayed up all night, watched it, and then 4th and 25. And the team that travels with me, very wary the next morning because they knew I was going to be in a bad mood. But we've got to value academics as much as we do athletics. We got to value academics as much as we do anything else. And that's got to be the ultimate goal, is to, not that everybody is going to be a great student, but everybody's going to get the tools they need to compete, because the world changes so fast. The average person today that's coming out of school, coming out of high school, is going to change jobs 7 times, and they're going to change careers 3 times in their lives, if they're average. And you cannot fall behind and have a chance in today's world. And so leadership, but also everybody else, that starting at the dinner table at home, this is what you need to do. This is what I'm looking at you. And you know, I had a great advantage. I picked my parents very carefully. And you know, my father was born in 1901, Ole Miss class of 22. His brother, born in 1896, Ole Miss class of 1916, who then became a West Pointer after that. And my aunt, born in 1894, who spoke and taught 4 languages. Wow. And so I just grew up in a household that it was sort of expected that you would read, that you would learn, and that was the most important thing. Now, it was a good thing in my case because I'm a pretty terrible athlete, but just having that parental support, that community support, to tell children, to tell the next generation coming up that this is the most important thing you can do. That's the big change that we've got to make, and frankly, we haven't done.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's go to the audience. Questions? Dick?
One of the most troubled pieces of blue water in the world is the South China Sea. You know, an important passage for energy to Japan and Korea, and a point of some fairly aggressive action by China. Comment on the South China Sea and how that's kind of being managed as one of the friction points of blue water.
Well, you're absolutely right. 40% of the world's trade passes through the South China Sea. And I'll go back to what I started talking about, its presence. We've been there for 7 decades. We're not escalating things when we send a carrier strike group or when we send a single ship. We're not escalating things when we send one of our marine amphibious ready groups through there. We've been there. We've been there for 70 years. And the countries in that region, China is among them, not the only one, but certainly among them, have been the beneficiaries. It is a little bit dangerous to start messing with that, because the major casualty that would befall something that changed that status quo in the South China Sea would be the economies of that region. Now, the whole world would suffer, but it would be mainly focused there. And so what we want is I know what we're going to do. We're going to continue to sail where we're allowed to sail by international law. We're going to continue to fly where we're allowed to fly in international law. We're going to make a point of doing that. We do that all the time, and we do it all over the world, too. It's not just confined to the South China Sea. But we also believe that you ought to follow the law. And the Court of International Arbitration in the Philippine case handed down a ruling that was very clear. And what we believe is that ought to be followed, and that the status quo, which is freedom of navigation, everybody gets to do what they need to do peacefully, and that the nations join together to fight things like piracy or transnational crime or whatever. That's the way we ought to cooperate. Not confrontationally, but cooperatively. But we're going to continue to have that presence. We're going to continue to insist on our freedom of navigation, both on the sea and in the air. And we're going to continue to do that in order to keep the economy of the world and in order to enforce international law.
Another question. Yes, Ralph.
Mr. Secretary, could you speak personally for a moment? I'm wondering, in the crystal ball of Ray Mabus, is there a possibility of ever coming back to Mississippi and entering political life so that you can change this state?
You know, Ralph, I think it's time for next generation to take that over. And I love this state. I always have, always will. I've devoted a large part of my life to it. I've devoted a large part of my life to being in government service. I think I'd like to devote the next chapter in my life to actually being with that family a little bit more. And to seeing my children, of whom I'm so immensely proud, and my wife, because they tease me. They say that when I show up now, I need to wear a name tag. And I'd like to get on a little more familiar basis with them. But thank you for asking.
Another question? Yes, Andy.
Ray, tell them about what you were telling me about Mexico. I think that's fascinating.
I was in Mexico last night.
That's fascinating.
And I tell you, for a guy from Ackerman, Mississippi, this was pretty cool. It was their Independence Day celebration, El Grito. And the Secretary of the Navy in Mexico, Admiral Soberon, is the only other Secretary of the Navy in the world, the only other person with that title. The British used to have First Lord of the Admiralty, which was Churchill's job, both in World War I and the beginning of World War II, but they got rid of it a couple of decades ago, and so we're the only two. And so we've become close friends and good partners. But the thing that we were talking about the most last night, and I can give you some numbers. I mean, we've done 55,000 man days with Marines, training their Marines. They sent a ship to rim of the Pacific. They're one of our great partners, not just in this hemisphere, but around the world. But the thing we talked most about was the vaquita. It's this little dolphin about this big. And I mean, I think it's universally said this is one of the cutest animals you've ever seen. And it's about to go extinct. And they don't know how many they have. They're very shy. And Admiral Soberon called me 3 or 4 months ago and asked for help in finding these vaquitas because they want to capture some and do a captive breeding program to keep the line going. And so we're training 3 older female dolphins in San Diego to go find the vaquita. And we'll deploy them next spring to Mexico.
Wow.
You know, one of the interesting things is we have dolphins protecting our facilities that nuclear weapons are stored at, and they're the most effective protection we have. And
How is that?
well, I mean, they patrol. So if somebody tries to swim, a diver tries to swim in, or unmanned underwater vehicle or whatever tries to get in, they're trained and they've got a little thing. It's like a collar, but it's got a big hook on it. They swim up to them, put that on them, it clamps onto a diver or whatever, and person in the boat reels them up.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Fred, you had a question.
Yes, you mentioned in your comments earlier about the Arctic ice melting, and certainly so now we're looking at, some people wouldn't like to talk about it, but that a new ocean opening up basically. And again, with more trade possibly, they're talking about Northwest Passage type of thing. What kind of planning does the Navy do at this stage for something that might be a century away? But do you think about it, or is there planning?
Yeah, it's not a century away. You're going to have an ice-free Arctic in the summer, probably at least within the next 2 decades. I mean, I was at the North Pole in March and took a submarine up there. We came up through the ice. The ice was about that thick at the North Pole. We had a guy called an ice pilot on board, that his job is to find places in the ice you can go up, and he said it's the thinnest he's ever seen. And we were right at the pole. He didn't have to look around to find a place to surface. So we've got an Arctic roadmap that we've laid out what we need to do for the next, until 2030. Most of our activity in the Arctic, most of the Navy activity is undersea. But we have a thing called ICEX every 2 years where we put a scientific camp out on the ice about 200 miles off the Alaskan coast and do scientific experiments. We also test military stuff around then. But as the ice melts, and ships are already passing through there now, through the Northwest Passage, And Russia, for example, has already said that the waters to its north are their internal passage. That's not right. It's not. It's international water. So once again, we're the ones that are going to have to keep that open. As it melts, you've got a lot of different claimants to the Arctic and to the resources on the seabed. And suddenly, things that were inaccessible are going to be accessible. Again, our responsibilities go up. The chance for friction goes up. We've got cruise ships going to the Arctic now. They really shouldn't be there. And so the search and rescue that for if something happens to one of those cruise ships, or if something happens to somebody's aircraft or fishing boat, also goes up. And one of the things Congress has gotten interested in are icebreakers. Our Coast Guard runs our icebreakers. We don't. We don't really have a need for icebreakers. But the Coast Guard only has 2. They're very old. We're way behind China. We're right behind Russia in that. And so Congress because we've got so much experience buying ships, one of the things that's moving through Congress is a task that we will help the Coast Guard in terms of contracting for and actually building the next icebreaker. We're paying a lot of attention to it. I stopped at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks on one of my trips because they're Arctic experts. The ice is not only melting quicker, but it's forming differently now. And it forms in very irregular patterns. We used to know how the ice was going to form. Because it forms in very irregular patterns, it's much more dangerous for our submarines going up there. And so we're working with them to try to understand what's happening there, try to be able to predict when a submarine goes in, and making sure that that submarine has the right tools to navigate through a pretty dangerous part of the world. Natural dangers, yeah.
Dick mentioned the blue waters of the South China Sea. The Gulf of Mexico waters weren't so blue after the BP oil spill. President Obama put you in charge of the report to follow up on making sure the proper actions were taken these many years later. What's your assessment of where we are and how things are down there?
Well, he appointed me in June of 2010. I got the report there by September 2010. It recommended some legislation and it recommended some executive action. So he put the executive orders that the report recommended into force then. Congress, in a rare show of bipartisanship, passed the recommendations from that report virtually intact in the Restore Act. And what it said was that a large part of the fines against BP and other companies, not the civil settlements, but the fines, should go to the states, should go to the places affected. And it set up some mechanisms for how that money was to be spent, so that you're not. I won't say what state this was. One of the things one state wanted was to build welcome centers up good ways from the Gulf with the money, but was to look to higher education to try to help prevent this in the future. And we've got a pretty good consortium of schools in Mississippi, but also all across the Gulf that work on this. But also for livelihoods, for economics, for tourism, for fishing, for all the things that we do on the Gulf. So far, about $1 billion has flowed into that fund. It looks like, given the way that the fines are being assessed, and it's still not quite finished, but that 15, 16 billion may come into that fund. And if that money is used correctly, I think you can see a resurgence and sort of a renaissance in the states around the Gulf.
Mhm.
And so one of the things I'm proudest of is that report, again, nobody expected Congress to act, but they did, and they did it in a very nonpartisan way.
Last question. Mississippi, for the 2 elections that President Obama ran, voted Republican. You've had an opportunity to work closely with President Obama. What insights do you have into the president that might help Mississippians who did not vote for President Obama? What can you tell us about him that these voters in Mississippi may not have seen or understood?
Well, you have to understand, I endorsed him in March of '07 when he was 40 points behind. So I liked him a good bit early on. But working with him, incredibly thoughtful, incredibly bright. He works through problems in a pretty non-emotional but very probing way. You don't get many opportunities to gloss over things, and that his I think he's got a good heart. I think he genuinely cares about people, about America, and about America's place in the world, and about how we transition into this new economy. How do we help people who have suffered, and how do we help the weakest among us? And so everything from expanding Medicaid to endorsing same-sex marriage to reaching out to our active duty and our veterans, and through Mrs. Obama's Joining Forces campaign, and to just being close to the military. I mean, he spends an enormous amount of his time. He goes up to Walter Reed, Bethesda, where our wounded warriors are, a lot. It's never announced. He never politicizes it. He goes up there, he spends a large part of a day there, and comes back. And the only people that know it are the folks up there, and us, because we know he's going. But those sorts of character traits, I believe, will carry him down through history as a very good president of the United States.
Good. Ray, I think most people here would agree that you have been a transformative person for Mississippi and now for and around the world. We're so grateful that you would come here to the Overby Center and share some of your views, and we're looking forward to seeing what you do in this next chapter of your life. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Charles.